Hi everybody, and welcome to today's webinar event. I'm Terry Ryder, founder of Hotspotting, and my special guest today is Brisbane real estate professional Mark Shorrock of Bluestone Property Management. And together today we're going to discuss ways for investors to benefit from the rising tide in the Brisbane market, because we think that right now it's a great time for Brisbane landlords, a great time to be a Brisbane landlord. The Brisbane market is rising, boosted by its relative affordability, a big infrastructure spend, and of course the prospect of hosting the 2032 Olympics. Demand from home buyers and investors, including large numbers of interstate buyers, has resulted in a massive uplift in sales activity across Brisbane, and prices are responding to that. At the same time, rental vacancy rates are low in most parts of the city, and there's great potential to lift rentals and yields. The key question for investors is how best to capitalise on all those factors. So the man with answers to these and other key questions is Mark Shorrock of Bluestone Property Management. So Mark, welcome.
Good morning, Terry. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be on one of your webinars and share, the information that we have from the coalface dealing with these situations directly with owners and tenants with your database of followers.
Yeah. Well, Mark, I've been talking to you for quite a number of years about the Brisbane market, and you're always a busy man, but I imagine that right now you'd be more busy now more than ever before.
Yeah, we are. It's a funny thing. Properties take a fraction of the time to rent, but still require an enormous amount of effort and resources to get that job done. It's certainly not complaining about the ease of being able to rent properties in the current market, that's for sure. But there's still a lot of work required in the background. Ultimately, the foundation that sets up any good tenancy is the screening process of the applicant and setting up the tenancy on the front end. So, we're always pleased to be able to ring our investors and inform them that there's been an increase because, let's face it, we haven't seen an increase in the rental market and or sales market really in Brisbane for around about 12 to 13 years. So a lot of investors have purchased properties and they've been told that they would see some growth, and which, investing in properties, like anything really, it's a gamble at the end of the day. And even industry experts like ourselves, key economists, property economists, they forecast growth, but sometimes it doesn't happen. It's really good to see that I think we're in the perfect storm in Brisbane at the moment, with a number of key contributing factors, all pointing in the right direction. And the cherry on the cake is the Olympic Games in 2032.
Yeah. So what's the biggest change that you've seen, observed and felt in the Brisbane market in, say, the last 6 to 12 months?
It'd really be the demand. We got through, I think Brisbane market was strong enough because of the disparity that had grown between Sydney and Brisbane and Melbourne in rental prices and sale values. What happened was that when COVID hit, those markets sort of were suppressed, and somewhat Brisbane was as well. But what happened was that we were somewhat insulated from the effects of COVID, and we bounced back really quickly, possibly quicker and stronger than other states because of how Brisbane and Queensland has handled COVID and lockdowns and so forth. But probably the biggest factor is the amount of migration, interstate migration from Sydney and Melbourne. Businesses have realised that they don't need to pay exorbitant rents down there for 2 or 3 floors of a building in a high rise in Sydney. They can minimise that back to half. Staff can work from home. If you're working from the outer suburbs of Sydney remotely 5 days a week, and there's no need for you to come into the office, then you may as well be working in Queensland. So, as I've always said, why holiday where you can live?
Yeah, well, I think it's pertinent probably to mention the latest population statistics, because just in the last few weeks we've seen the latest release from the Australian Bureau of Statistics describing what's happened with population trends, particularly internal migration in 2020, last year. And by internal migration, we're talking about people moving from one part of Australia to other parts of Australia. And what that shows is that Sydney and Melbourne have been losing population to internal migration big time. It's been happening for a number of years in both for both Melbourne and Sydney, but in particular more so than ever before in 2020. So they've lost a big time. And where are people going? Well, the biggest gainer has been Brisbane and Southeast Queensland. And I think that's what you're describing with what you're talking about here today.
Yes, and I look, I to be honest, don't look at the figures in detail, but I do know that pre-COVID, I think that was already happening, where Brisbane, for the first time in a while, had outstripped Sydney and Melbourne for interstate migration. And again now, because of COVID, people are getting away and coming up. Yeah. And what that translates to us is just demand for rental properties. We see locals sort of balking at a small increase because we haven't seen increases for sort of that 12 to 13 years. In fact, many prices of rents and sale value have decreased in Brisbane around about 5 to 10% over that time frame. So the local market is sort of balking at a small increase because they're not accustomed to it. Whereas we're seeing Sydney and Melbourne tenants come up and Sydney and Melbourne buyers come up and throw in what I call sort of strong money at property. And that is the primary driving force. It's just there are more people looking for property than there are properties available. Yeah. And we're seeing a market which I haven't experienced in 22 years.
Okay. So what's the typical scenario when a new property comes onto your books? You've got a new investor owner who's got a property that they want to list as being available for rent. What sort of numbers are you typically getting in terms of prospective tenants?
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Terry. If it was a house in the sort of middle to outer ring, we've been experiencing anywhere from about 30 to 70 tenants registering, with 20 to 50 people coming through the inspections. From that, we might receive 20 to 30 applications, and we are seeing tenants paying up to. So sometimes, depending on the strategy, which I'll come back to, I'll touch on it now actually, just to put it into context. If the investor has been quite advantageous with their price, we might not see any of those tenants offering extra rent over and above the advertised price. But if as we do see, some owners are like that, some investors are very conservative and they will keep the price the same as what it has been for the past 5 years, because their strategy is to minimise the vacancy period to be as short as possible and to make up for that increase with an occupancy. So we're seeing anything from $5 to $10 a week extra to $50 a week extra.
Yeah. So what you're describing is a property becomes available for rent. You're getting like a minimum of like 30 parties registered, sometimes as many as 70. And it's become reasonably common for people offering more than the asking to beat the competition to secure that property as a tenant.
Yep, that's correct. So that's just the demand, and our locals aren't used to all the hype. 12 months ago or 2 years ago, we could take 2 to 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, sometimes up to 6 weeks to rent a property. And over that time frame, we might only have half a dozen or a dozen people look at it, as opposed to now.
So we've got a couple of factors there. Not only a lot of people applying for any available rentals, but some of those people applying in many cases will be people from outside of Queensland, people moving from interstate, from Sydney perhaps, and they're willing to pay more because they're used to paying more, and that's adding that extra competitive element and pushing up rents.
That's correct. And there are some other problems which come with the benefits. Like anything, there's sort of pros and cons, or the yin and the yang of it. And that is that a lot of those people that are coming up might only be looking for a 6-month lease. We try to sort of deter our owners from taking a 6-month lease because there's a lot of effort and cost involved in rolling that tenancy over in another 6 months' time, maybe a vacancy period. We could have a lockdown due to COVID then, where we can't show properties and only do video walkthroughs. We may have to accept the tenant on a sight unseen with a special condition in the clause. But what it has afforded investors is the privilege of being able to go through and look at, we might shortlist half a dozen applications as opposed to where we used to only have one. And in those half a dozen, there may be a couple of people in high risk employment like hospitality, tourism, You may have a couple of interstate people that are offering more money but only want a 6-month lease. And I guess the trick is for us or any investor is having a property manager that can help them navigate their way through that and assess every application on its own merits and put them forward to the owner with their pros and cons. Because I know from history that the tenant prepared to pay the highest rent isn't always the one that's the best to accept. So you could have another applicant at, say, $10 less a week that's a long-term tenant. They aren't just looking for a 6-month lease because they want to buy their own property. Personally, I would probably be leaning towards the long-term tenant because I know from 22 years experience that you can make a lot more money with 100% occupancy and a slightly less rent over any given period of time.
Yeah, I know that when we spoke in the previous webinar we did, you actually laid out some case studies and data showing that very point, that it's often results in a bigger return, a bigger annual income, if you perhaps accept a slightly lesser rental, but have a smaller vacancy period rather than holding out for the higher rental and having a longer vacancy period. You actually end up in the year with less income. That's
correct, yeah. And look, if my details will be available at the end here or people can contact you for them, more than happy to share those case studies with any of your clients, Terry.
Yeah. So perhaps we can talk about what we actually proposed to do today was to talk about how people can make the best of this situation. And I think you suggested that investor owners can achieve sometimes rental increases of 10 or 15% in the current climate if they go about it the right way.
Yeah, correct. So the first thing that we look at with our investors, Terry, is that in these good times, there's always the challenges that are faced in educating the tenants about that aren't used to an increase. What there? So what we generally say to our owners is that while if the property was vacant, you might see, let's say, a 10% increase. It's a worthwhile consideration to keep the current tenant. Better the devil you know than the devil you don't. And if you could, say, have a 5% increase with the current tenant staying in the property, again, as I've got another case study around this, we can show how investors can make more money with just a 5% increase because they don't have a 2-week vacancy period, the cost of the advertising, the cost of the reletting, which is typically one week's rent plus GST. So on average, our properties, it costs an investor one of our properties to around about $1,000 to $1,500 to have a turnover of tenants. And that's because you have a vacancy period, advertising and the reletting fees. Yep. So that can easily be offset by the 5% loss with the gain of the increased 5%. And also you minimise the risk of bringing a tenant on that we know that for all intensive purposes, we can heavily screen a tenant, doctors, dentists, lawyers, teachers, anybody they can present to be perfectly good on paper. And for whatever reason, circumstances outside of our control, there's a relationship breakup and they go off the rails and the property gets damaged. So in that case there, we generally say, look, maybe a 5% increase for your current tenants to stay in the property. And if the property was become vacant, they gave notice and moved out, then we would try and get, say, a 10% increase for ease of explanation.
Yeah, and the state of the current market will certainly sustain and increase that big 10 or 15% increase in rents if the property is vacant and it's relet.
Correct. Yeah, and it comes back, as we talked in our last webinar, Terry, to presentation. Well presented, well maintained, clean property, some good quality photos used in the advertising, the marketing, and a good quality agent marketing that property for you, getting the maximum number of inquiries, inspections, and ultimately applications for the owner to choose from.
Yeah, okay. Well, it might be a good time to touch on some of the reasons why we're in the conditions where you can get that kind of rental increase. I think it comes down firstly to vacancy rate. We've seen the Brisbane vacancy rate over recent years steadily reducing. And the figures out this week from SQM Research shows, I think their figure for Brisbane was 1.4% as the average vacancy rate across metropolitan Brisbane, heading towards 1%, which describes a very, very tight rental market.
Yeah, many of the suburbs that we have managements in, excuse me, we sort of had little clusters of geographical locations that have been investment hotspots, I guess, over the past 10 years that our investors own properties in, and many of those are actually below 1%. However, we do have a couple of properties sprinkled. We have a pocket in Kelvin Grove in the inner city, which is appealing to young professionals and also the university students, and some other properties sprinkled around the inner city. Now, the inner city market isn't performing as strong, still a little bit of oversupply, not as quite as much demand from inner city workers and or the university tenants. However, we've been able to manage some ex-hotel short-term accommodations and get a very good yield. Not quite as good as what probably people were achieving beforehand, but still much better than nothing at all.
Yeah.
But yeah, the vacancy rates generally, we would see them, I think, about 0.9% on average across our portfolio. But we're operating at around about 0.8 or 0.7 even.
Okay.
What
are some of those investment hotspots you mentioned? Which particular areas across Brisbane are particularly strong?
Yeah, we're seeing, we've got sort of the Moreton, Launton, Mango Hill, that sort of what they call the Moreton area. There's a bit of a golden triangle up there, I think, that you've referenced before and we've spoken about. Yeah. There's North Lakes, and then that northern pocket of Brisbane up around the Castledine area. Another pocket that's been doing particularly well, Everton Park. So they're probably the three geographical concentrations where we've seen a lot of investment and a very strong demand from tenants.
So when you're talking about the Moreton, that's the Moreton Bay region local government area, which is I guess the outer ring northern suburbs of the Brisbane metropolitan area, and includes suburbs such as Launton, you mentioned Mango Hill, North Lakes, which is a master planned community that's been a work in progress for, I don't know, 20 years or more. A place with a high level of infrastructure, great retail offerings, schools and all of that. So it's, I guess, not surprising that that's a very, very popular precinct for people to rent.
Yeah, that's correct. And I think one of the key factors which has been added there is the university in Petrie. So that I think in stage 1 of 10 is around about 1,000 students, but up to 10,000 within, let's say, 10 years. So that will grow and demand will grow in that area.
And of course, that university campus hasn't been able to operate as normal up to this point, but when things return to what we used to regard as normal, we're going to see probably that will unleash quite a bit of demand into that Petrie Launton area. Absolutely. And I think that the fact that the university market brings to the economy of Australia is one of our highest imports, so to speak. In the government, from what I've heard, are extremely determined to get the university students back. I dare say that they'll be back before international travellers and borders are opened up. I can't remember who it is, but it's some ex-CEO or some government person or the army official that's been put in charge of trying to sort of drive that. So hopefully we see that happen, and that's just for anybody who owns a property in those areas, especially any of the inner city where the traditional university market is. But, another area, Terry, we manage properties in that we've seen it has struggled over the years slightly compared to some of the other markets is that Logan area. Yeah. It has seen similar growth. It's a cheaper price point, but the growth and everything is quite relative to those other markets, which we've mentioned. Yeah, so that's another pocket. And again, it's these sort of areas that are connecting Brisbane to the Gold Coast, Brisbane to the Sunshine Coast. Also think that Western Corridor will do quite well over time because
The Springfield Lakes is like another master plan community, as you mentioned, with a massive amount of infrastructure. But I heard the number yesterday when I was driving, but I was on the phone and didn't pay attention. And someone mentioned something about the volume of people moving to southeast Queensland, and it's astronomical. So it will undoubtedly put a bit of pressure on the infrastructure, but with some big projects like the Queen Street Wharf and the duplication of the Brisbane Airport, Cross River Rail and things like that, I think it's a very appealing city to invest in.
Yeah, I think that the figures from the ABS published in the last week or so show that in 2020 there was a net gain of 30,000 people for Brisbane and southeast Queensland in 2020 alone. By far the greatest gain from internal migration anywhere in Australia, and a lot of those people are coming out of Sydney and Melbourne. Yeah,
and you'd think that Brisbane, couldn't handle it, and probably can't, to be honest. But another interesting thing I found out during the week was that a lot of people from Brisbane are migrating to the regional areas. So we're sort of seeing this ripple effect. The stone's been thrown in the pond in Brisbane, and then people are jumping out of Sydney and Melbourne into Brisbane, and some people from Brisbane, less than 30,000, no doubt. I don't think the numbers there would be relative at all, but there is a reasonably large proportion of people that are leaving Brisbane because they no longer need to work in an office, don't need to be based so close to the city, and this COVID has sort of enforced upon them an alternative lifestyle which they've enjoyed, and they can do that from a regional area.
Yeah, as you know, I'm in Maloney in the Sunshine Coast hinterland, so that's maybe an hour north of where you're sitting, north and west up in the hills. Within an hour's drive of the centre of Brisbane. But I know that the markets here are getting a lot of demand out of Brisbane, so people are making that choice. We don't need to be in the city. And so they can move to an area like this, the Blackall Range area, with a number of attractive towns, great sense of community, but still be in touch with Brisbane if they need to go there. So that's all part of the trend we're talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting how I think these pandemics, it's the force of change. I mean, 100 years ago, and I think roughly about 100 years before that, the last two pandemics have been roughly 100 years apart. And people have gone back and viewed it and seen that these pandemics have forced through the shortest period the greatest amount of change. Yes. And forces people to do things in a different way. And we're experiencing that for ourselves now. Yeah,
I think it's important to point out for people that certainly what the numbers tell us is that this trend of people moving from the big cities to the smaller cities like Brisbane, or from places like Brisbane to regional areas, has actually been underway for a number of years. We know Sydney's been losing population to internal migration for 10 years, and Melbourne for the last 3 or 4. So it hasn't really been a COVID thing. It's just that the COVID year, 2020, has sped it up, given it greater momentum, and made more people aware of the possibilities of working from home or working remotely, and therefore not needing to be in those big, expensive, congested cities like Sydney and Melbourne. So it's a part of a trend that's been going on for some time. So that's one of the reasons why we think it's got longevity. It's not going to be just a flash in the pan COVID thing and then it'll go back to where it was. I think it's a trend that's been underway for a while, and it's got longevity.
Yeah, and you might be able to add something to this sort of from a more research and data level, Terry, but I do know that, say, Queensland just in simple form is, the growth can be backed primarily by the jobs. And when about 15 odd years ago, the oil and gas sort of relocated from Brisbane down to Sydney and or Melbourne, we lost a lot of jobs, and there's been some projects which haven't gone ahead or approved in Queensland. But now we're seeing some of the big companies, Qantas, for instance, looking to relocate potentially to Brisbane. Virgin, who did a deal with the Queensland government to stay in Brisbane. We've seen a number of these other companies that I'm hearing about, large national or international companies considering Brisbane as their base again, which is super positive for our property market.
Yeah. And I think the infrastructure spend is a big part of the reason why more and more people are coming into Brisbane. I think what Brisbane has lacked, the reason why Brisbane has perhaps not up until this point had a real estate boom similar to what Sydney and Melbourne had from 2013 to 2017, is that there has been, until recently, very little happening across Brisbane in terms of new infrastructure, but that's changed a lot. I mean, you touched briefly on it. I think Mark mentioned Queen's Wharf, which is a $3 billion project. We've got the Brisbane Live development, $2 billion, Cross River Rail, which is $5.5 billion, expansion of the airport. There's a whole lot more. I've got just a list in front of me, and they're sort of about 10 major projects totaling about $25 billion. And that's kind of activity generates a lot of economic activity, creates jobs, and that brings new people coming into the city of Brisbane to work in those projects, and they're obviously looking for somewhere to live, either to buy or to rent.
Yeah, I heard it on. Yeah, that's correct, and I heard a good sort of point mentioned on the phone. I saw on the radio the other day, and it was Sergio Biocchi-Peterson who coined the phrase the crane economy.
Yeah.
And you only have to look at the Brisbane skyline and see that the amount of cranes, even on that Queen's Wharf, 9 cranes on that one site in itself is quite amazing to see. But yeah, there's certainly a lot of cranes in the air, and that's a pretty good indicator that the infrastructure is going ahead.
Yeah.
And with that comes the people behind it, jobs and accommodation.
And of course, what's going to supercharge that trend of infrastructure development in the greater Brisbane area is the likelihood that Brisbane will be hosting the Olympic Games in 10 years' time. And that's going to necessitate an even bigger infrastructure spend to create the facilities that will be needed for the various venues that Brisbane will require, but also accommodation and other factors. And in fact, about 2 weeks ago, there was an announcement in relation to that of a $1 billion redevelopment of the Gabba, which is people out there who follow any form of sport will know as the main cricket ground in Brisbane, also the venue for AFL for the Brisbane Lions. So that facility is going to have $1 billion invested in it, primarily because of the almost certainty that Brisbane will be hosting the 2032 Olympics.
Yeah, that's all of that is great news for us, and it sort of gives us something at the end. We don't know how long this will go for. People are talking about the bubble bursting and little things like that. Honestly, I don't think that will happen with my 22 years hands-on experience in the industry. I think that because the disparity between Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne is so great and the amount of people we've got migrating here from those places, that will continue to grow from strength to strength, and that even the RBA forecast early this year around about 30% growth over the next 3 years at least. That at the end of that will only be, let's say we get 3 to 4 years, and we're at sort of 2024, 25. We're only about 5 or 6 years away from the Olympic Games. And I found an article which I shared with you the other day, independent article from academics, where they've researched the last 5 capital cities to host Olympic Games, and those capital cities have benefited 19% above and beyond other capital cities in the host nation. And that's around that infrastructure. Admittedly, they're not building, the white elephant locations anymore. Now with COVID, I don't think, part of the reason that Brisbane has been given, in the box seat to get the 2032 Olympic Games is that a large portion of the facilities are existing infrastructure. Excuse me. However, they do require, significant upgrades. The benefit to that is there's still, jobs and accommodation needed, but the additional benefit is that, people don't end up with a massive 100,000 seat capacity stadium as a white elephant in their backyard.
Yeah. I think the important point for investors to be aware of is that what I believe to be true and what we've seen from recent experience, including the Gold Coast with the 2018 Commonwealth Games, is that the the boom for real estate actually comes before the event, more so than after it. I mean, there was a lot of speculation that the Gold Coast would have a post-Commonwealth Games probably boom. It actually had a bit of a boom before it because it was the infrastructure spend, the jobs it created, bringing new people into work into those projects, getting ready for the Games. So Brisbane, I think, can look forward to the next 10 years of elevated activity of infrastructure investment, which is going to be creating impetus in property markets leading up to the Games.
That's correct. I've got a case study here that I share with our investors, Terry. I'm just going to try and find it for you. So let's get my screen to play. So this is strangely enough, I won't mention any company names or businesses, but this is the director of a company an advisory company which tells people to sort of invest in certain areas, and he's got a portfolio of properties, and we managed 3 of those and had considered offloading 1, 2, possibly 3 of them. And I sort of asked why, and he sort of wanted to, potentially invest elsewhere or put the money, not necessarily into property or other things. And I just sort of thought it was a bit of a strange thing for someone like that to be doing if they have, told people to invest in a particular area, being a suburb of Brisbane or, Logan or Moreton, to turn around and then sell that property. So I thought I'd put this together. Now, to put that into context, some of the people who we manage properties for have been, told, go and buy in this suburb because it is forecast for growth, and they haven't seen the growth. Now, we haven't seen that growth across Brisbane, as I said, for sort of 12 to 13 years. And as I also said earlier, that investing is a gamble like anything else. So a lot of these people who do, tell people go and buy here, go and buy those properties in those suburbs themselves. So they've got some skin in the game, so to speak. Now, this 3-year case study, it was an investor selling to clear debt. And, through the figures that I'm about to mention and share with you, they decided to hold, and potentially forecast they could make an extra $334,000 over the next 3 years. Now, I will jump in quickly and say that, we as agents can't provide financial advice. So always encourage everybody listening to go away and do your own research and form your own opinion on this. But just as a general scenario or case study, we rented the property for $35 a week more than what it had been rented. That same property now, within a couple of months, could probably even rent for another $10, maybe $15 more. So over 3 years, that's an extra $5,500 in that investor's pocket. Now, when you add the 30% growth, which the RBA forecast, we've got an extra $260,000 worth of equity, and we combine that with the extra rent, and effectively we can by an investor holding onto a property rather than selling it in 3 years' time, they could have an extra $330,000 in their back pocket. That's additional rent that's been collected during that period. Not just the additional rent, sorry, the total rent plus the 5, 10, 15% we've been talking about, plus the uplift in revenue from the equity in the property being valued at, let's say, 500,000, and 30% on top of that takes it up to close to 700,000. So that doesn't even take into consideration the Olympic Games, because at the time we put this together, we didn't have that announcement at hand. But that just sort of proves that there are a lot of costs associated when people buy investment properties. There's also a lot of costs associated when they sell them, and that money's gone. Once you buy in and sell out, the money's gone. Yep. So when people tell me they're selling, I always say, well, where are you going to put your money next? Yep. And if people are putting their money into property elsewhere, just think about that someone could be making a bit of money off you doing that deal without taking into consideration the costs or the loss that you're picking up through the transaction of buying and selling that initial investment property. So there can be some massive uplifts in sitting on and retaining your investment property. people ask me what I would do, and I said, look, ultimately it's your decision, but if I owned an investment property in Brisbane at the moment, I wouldn't be selling unless the bank manager was knocking on my door about to repossess the property.
Yeah. So just to clarify, the case study you mentioned, there's two elements there. There's the increase in rentals, which is available because of the uplift in the market at the moment, the low vacancies and the high demand from tenants, but you're also projecting their capital growth, and you've referenced the 30% in over 3 years forecast by the Reserve Bank in terms of their forecast for property value increase.
That's correct. So on let's say a $500,000 property, that's going to increase 30% over 3 years. That there gets you up close to, so let's say, 650, 700,000. The rent that you will achieve over that time frame, let's say it was $25,000 a year as it is, and then you're adding an extra 15% to that. So yes, we're adding the rent that you're already receiving, but you wouldn't have received that if you've sold the property today. You get in around about an extra $75,000 rent that you wouldn't have received. So that's your original rent plus the 10 to 15% extra. And just think that that's equity that's in investors' back pocket. Why many of our owners have bought a property, let's say on average off our portfolio 7 years ago, and the rents haven't gone up. In fact, they've gone backwards 5 to 10% over that time frame. The value of the property hasn't gone up. In fact, it's gone backwards 5 to 10% over that time frame. Why now, when we're forecast to receive so much growth, and we've been given, basically the Olympic Games to lose, and I don't believe any host nation has ever been to the point that we're at and hasn't actually successfully been appointed the games, that you would sell and forego all of that potential capital growth and extra revenue.
Yeah, Mark, we've got some questions now coming into the Q&A panel and the chat box, and I would encourage people out there watching and listening to type in your questions. We're happy to field your questions. But there's a question there from Julian that's kind of pertinent to what we're just currently talking about. Julian asking what we think of the Beenleigh-Eagleby area. That's in Logan City, in the southern part of the Brisbane metropolitan area, heading towards the Gold Coast. Julian's asking, is growth likely there? I'm considering selling a property there and buying elsewhere. And imagine, Julian, that your situation is you've owned that property for a while, you're hoping for some capital growth, you haven't actually seen much, so you've been thinking of selling. And I think just carrying on from what Mark's been saying in his case study, if you're being patient this long, I would suggest being patient a while longer, because I think that the market that you're in is now getting to the point where it's actually going to show that growth that you were hoping for, and it would be a shame to sell just before you're going to realise some gains. Would you agree with that, Mark?
Absolutely, Terry, without a doubt. I think Warren Buffett sums it up, possibly the world's foremost expert on investment, in that wealth is the transfer from the impatient to the patient. I did notice a question there. Someone had asked about Logan as around about the time we were talking about, but that Waterford, Eagleby, Logan area is all in the same geographical concentration. Look, it's a great area. It will grow with the rest of Brisbane and southeast Queensland. Again, it is relative. It's a slightly cheaper price point than some other areas of that North Brisbane, Moreton area that we mentioned. Yeah. You can buy for cheaper. Yes, the rent's a little bit cheaper, a slightly different demographic. And while suburbs sort of in Brisbane or the Gold Coast or North Brisbane might increase by, 15%, and in this year you might only see 12% growth, for instance. In any other year, that can be flipped around the other way. These sort of, we see the growths, as Terry can confirm, sort of come and go in different peaks and troughs, but generally the area will lift as a whole. So, yeah, I certainly wouldn't be selling that. I've got another case study. As you can tell, Terry knows I love case studies, because I find that they resonate with people when they can look at a case study and they can read a little bit of a commentary around it, but look at the facts and figures next to each other on a spreadsheet that they can see. For a $500,000 property, and I do realise this is probably slightly above the price point of Logan down there, but let's say your average cost to get into that property around about $16,500, and your cost on average to get out of a $500,000 property around about $17,500. So that's mortgage establishment fees, mortgage closure fees, conveyancing fees on the purchase and the sale, stamp duty on the front end, if you paid that. Then on the tail end, you've got agents' commission, advertising, things like that. Now, that's around about $34,500 on a $500,000 property. So that could easily be high $20,000 on a $400,000 property. That money's gone. Once you sell that property, that $25,000, $30,000 is gone. Yeah. And it's likely wherever else you're investing and it's property again, then you start to incorporate those costs again.
Yeah. Might just focus a little bit further on Logan City, because we've had a couple of questions. Julian, we've responded to it. Frank was also asking about that market. Look at the southern portion of the Brisbane metropolitan area. It's the land bridge, I suppose, between Brisbane City and Gold Coast City. So very nicely located between two major areas, and of course that attracts demand because it's very affordable, more affordable than central Brisbane or the Gold Coast. So it's been targeted by first-home buyers, investors on a budget. One of the things I like about this area, in terms of it's now starting to have its time to shine, is that there's quite a big infrastructure spend happening, impacting on Logan City. There's the M1 that connects Brisbane to the Gold Coast goes through Logan City. It's got a transport spine consisting of the M1 motorway and also the rail link. But they're duplicating that M1 because of the demand, congestion that sometimes accumulates there. So there's what they call the Coomera connector, the first stage, where there's a multi-billion-dollar project happening that will impact positively for Logan City. Also, many other infrastructure projects, including major hospital expansion. So I think Logan City is coming into a period of growth, and we're actually getting lots of anecdotal evidence, including a major builder that operates throughout Brisbane, the Gold Coast, the Sunshine Coast. Where they're getting most demand at the moment for house and land packages is actually in Logan City. They can't keep up with the demand they're getting for people wanting to buy in that affordable part of the Brisbane market.
Yeah, that's and the other thing to add there, Yarrabilba, I think, is another sort of master plan community which will link sort of Ipswich to Springfield to the Logan pocket, which is linking north back towards Brisbane and south towards the Gold Coast. There's only going to be a very small band of land left between Gold Coast and Brisbane. And as I was going to touch on, the duplication of the highway, I think, is impacting through Eagleby. But this can only be those prices subdued or suppressed for so long. It doesn't necessarily always need to be the most affordable sort of pocket, because once the infrastructure's in there and the demand is in there, then we will see those prices come up in line or possibly overtake other areas.
Yeah. Now, if we can move perhaps a little bit further west, Pahu's asking about generally about the Ipswich City area, which is the neighbour of Logan City in the south. Ipswich is the southwestern portion of the Brisbane metropolitan area, and they're asking about in particular Springfield Lakes, which is a master plan community, a work in progress that's been going on for 20 years already. Quite an amazing achievement. What used to be wasteland has been turned into a city, and it's still happening. It's got a university campus, private hospital, commercial precinct. Many thousands of people now living there in modern homes, and with rail links direct to the centre of Brisbane now established from Springfield as well. So do you get demand for that area as well, Mark, with what you do?
We do. We don't get a lot, to be honest. However, I do live north of the river in Brisbane, so north of Springfield, but in Brisbane. And I'm quite familiar with that area because over the years, the 30 years I've been in Brisbane and the 22 years I've been, hands-on in real estate and property management, I'm very familiar with that area now. that, like any master plan community, I think the easiest way to sort of put it in just perspective for the people listening today is it's easy if you're buying in the early or middle stages of those master plan projects to see you be a little bit disillusioned because you possibly sold in on the guys that you're going to get this growth and you get really high rentals and they're going to keep increasing and you don't sort of, you might get the rent initially, but then it has come back and we haven't seen the growth they forecast and you don't have the equity that you were told you would get. Now, that's not necessarily the person's fault who has sold the people these properties, but, circumstantial. Brisbane didn't fire when we should have after the GFC when Sydney and Melbourne did. We didn't go in 2011 when the floods were on as well. And we were primed to go. We actually started to see growth before COVID. And that was sort of knocked on the head with COVID, but we're coming back very strong now. But what I typically tell people in those areas is that you buy in for, say, $450,000 a house and land package. And another reason we don't see much growth in rents and sale prices in those areas is because for the next 20 years, they keep releasing a couple of hundred blocks of land and house and land packages in new stages and developments. But where you will see, if you waited this long, where you will see your growth is that in that particular pocket, once they stop developing stages of land and releasing 200 or 300 blocks of house and land per year, the supply has stopped and demand continues to grow, that you see significant increases in price. So, yeah, look, I think Springfield, along with any of the other master plan communities, are a great place to invest, primarily because there's the infrastructure for your tenants to get in and out and have employment, and they will always be in demand.
Now, Annie is asking a question about a suburb which is right next door to all of that, the Springfield community, which is Redbank Plains, is saying that they've owned investment property since 2013. They had growth for 4 or 5 years, but more recently it's gone a little bit backwards. And what do we think of that market? Look, I think we're going to see growth in the actual city market, including that area that you're talking about around Redbank Plains, Goodna. I think its time to shine is just starting to happen as part of the Brisbane market, which is having tremendous uplift at the moment. And Ipswich City, like Logan City, is at the more affordable end of it. But what I like about Ipswich City is that it's got some very significant employment nodes. So people are buying out there because it's affordable, but also close to where they're working, because some very significant major commercial industrial estates. There's a RAF base out at Ipswich. The master plan communities like Springfield and also Ripley are creating jobs nodes as well. We're seeing business such as there was a federal government contract of $5 billion to build vehicles for the Army awarded about a year ago, and that's all happening very close to Redbank Plains, that Redbank industrial estate. That's where the factory will be producing those vehicles. That $5 billion contract primarily will be happening. So I think, Annie, be patient a little while longer. I think you're going to see some growth in that market. What are your thoughts, Mark?
I agree with everything you've said, Terry. I think that other pocket that's benefiting is Wacol. There's an industrial area there, or a lot of land that's been sitting vacant for the 30 years I've been in Brisbane. I believe that if it's not that defence project that you named, there are several major projects that have been approved for that area. Land which has been unproductive, excuse me, is now, jobs have come in through the infrastructure and demand for building those sites, plus then after they go, the jobs will still be there for the employees. But yeah, absolutely. I think Redbank, it'll get picked up by Springfield, Ipswich, out to the west, you've got Ripley, down to the south, you've got the Yarra Bilba, and it's relatively easy for people there to either go back to Ipswich or into Brisbane or even head down to the Gold Coast. So yeah, I certainly think it'll get picked up in the general growth of what we call the Greater Brisbane area.
Sure. Now, Michelle's asking a question about perhaps the characteristics of a good rental property. the makeup of the property itself, but also its location in terms of what factors beside proximity to schools and transport would make a house more popular than others, whether it's 3 or 4 bedrooms or other things that might be close to. But what are the parameters of good rental house in your view, Mark?
Yep. The key one over and above, because typically if you've already have an investment property, it's very hard to change that configuration, is that it's well maintained and clean. So that will help anybody listening today who already owns a property. We generally see more people now looking for 4-bed, 2-bath, 2-car homes. But that doesn't mean that if you've only got a 3-2-1 or a 3-1-1 that you need to go and sell, because again, if you sell and it costs you $30,000, it'll take you a long time in a 4-bed, 2-bath, 2-car to make up that loss. The key factors outside of that I think is worthwhile, air conditioning. It's sort of become a bit of a prerequisite up here in Queensland. It along with pets are the 2 most highly searched terms for realestate.com. So you can get away with charging a little bit more rent, be open to having pets in the property. Yes, they are harder to manage. Yes, they do cause more damage. Yes, there is more risk involved, but if it's managed properly and you can get a tenant to pay more rent and through good management, they don't cause that damage. Regular routine inspections, good tenant selection, put some air conditioners into an air conditioner into a general bedroom. We see it increase the rent by about $10 a week. A master bedroom, maybe 15, into a living area, $20 odd a week. Most investors can recover the cost of adding air conditioning, just a split system, in around about 3 years. There's some very good brands available. We generally go for the ones, our investors go for the ones which are spin-offs of the major manufacturers, like and a bit of a no-names brand. They aren't as economical, which is why they're cheaper, but then the tenant pays for that because they're paying for the electricity. So you can get a unit into a property for around about $1,200 to $1,500, and you'll get that back in a couple of years, and then that will that extra money that air conditioners you've installed is sort of icing or cream on the cake.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and imagine in Brisbane, more so than some of the southern capitals, that air conditioning unit. It's an important thing to have, but as you pointed out, you can actually achieve a much better rental if you're offering that to your tenant.
Yes, yeah, we get our interstate investors. They don't understand it. Understandably, if you come from Canberra, you probably don't need air conditioning, or Melbourne. But up here in Queensland, very humid, very hot. We get longer, hotter, more humid summers. And, when I moved up here in 1979 and I was young, we never had air conditioners in the classrooms, but classrooms have air conditioners now. Most businesses have air conditioning. And then, from that, basically, that has sort of translated across to accommodation. But yeah, a good investment. So they're the things I'd be looking at. If you're buying new, if you can get 4-bed, 2-bath, 2-car, air conditioned, and I'd definitely go for split systems, not ducted. Ducted systems are great for about 10 years until they start to go wrong and they become extremely expensive to replace.
I think I would totally agree with that.
Yep. Be open to pets, but be very strict on 2 things. Is we typically always try and find a tenant that has rented before with the pets, and they get a good application with the pets, that they've lived in a property with them before. Dogs are better than cats, cause less damage, and that we can't get any extra bond for those pets. So if you're open to pets and you can screen, and then the last thing is that there's a condition or a pet agreement, either in the lease if possible, it may not technically be enforceable, or a separate pet agreement where that holds the tenant accountable for any additional damage caused by that pet. But look, it can make the property, even if it's more rentable. Like if a property rented a week earlier because you had air conditioning in it or open to pets, it's an extra $400 or $500 in your pocket.
Yeah.
If tenants stay in a property rather than moving out because you've got air conditioning, and you get 100% occupancy over 3 years, even if the rent's slightly lower, then you will yield a higher income from that property. So yeah, there's a number of key factors, but yeah, 4-bed, 2-bath, 2-car, air conditioned, and if possible, be open to pets, as long as they're heavily screened and there's conditions in place to cover and protect you.
And Chris is asking some questions about that projected, I think it was the Reserve Bank forecasting 30% price growth over 3 years, and asking, was that going to be across the board? Will it be more so in some areas than others? Well, I think that's always the case, that there's always going to be areas that will outperform. Those sorts of forecasts are very generalised, and better locations are going to perhaps outperform and show better growth than the average, and others will underperform. That would be normal, wouldn't it, Mark, in your experience?
It would be, and I think they call it the gentrification, is that the suburbs that do lag behind, typically the top end suburbs fire first, which they are, because the people are well heeled and they're not reliant on as much on finance and things like that. But as time goes on, some suburbs might fire first and harder than other suburbs, but over that time period, they might slow down in the tail end of the 3-year period, where your other areas that are lower socioeconomic, a lower price point, will have a lower average, but far more consistent or peak at the other end. And that's like everything. Those trends happen in every market and every industry.
So Chris is raising those issues, specifically mentioned the suburb of Doolandella. Is that one that you're familiar with? We
don't have anything in Doolandella, but I am familiar. I think it was relative to sort of that Logan, Waterford, Eagleby area that we talked about before, in that it's been a lower price point and it's more affordable. Because of that, the rents are lower. That attracts a certain demographic. But as time goes on, and if we use an example of one suburb in the middle of 5 others, and those 5 others have grown around them, and that's sort of been the ugly duckling, it doesn't stay suppressed forever. I mean, the data's there that eventually that suburb becomes a prime suburb for investors, renovators, the younger, cool, hippie sort of generation come through and start to come in there, a bit more alternate, and then demand outstrips supply, and then we see those suburbs increase significantly and catch up very, very quickly.
Right.
And that can be seen in any capital city around Australia and many, many suburbs. The hard data is there to prove that they will generally keep up and have every suburb will have its day.
Yeah. Anya is asking a question that you probably can't answer specifically because it's about a specific property, but perhaps in general terms you could respond. Anya is saying, I have an investment property in Morayfield. That's the Moreton Bay region, the north of Brisbane. The tenant has a lease until September. What's the maximum amount of rent you can increase per week? Just in general terms, in that kind of location, what sort of increases, if it's a good property, might you be looking at?
Yep, so 5 to 10% is what we generally see without having seen the property. But to reiterate and to just add a little bit more context to that is that, see, the problem we face is that the current tenants living in the property, if they haven't been out and given, say, notice of a rent increase and considered moving, they haven't experienced for themselves that the demand out there in the general rental market has increased significantly from the last time they looked. So we're finding a lot of tenants when we go to them, let's say with a 10% increase, sort of saying, really 10%? That's a lot. I've been living here for 5 years and the rent's never gone up. That in that case, we're sort of trying to provide some additional information to those tenants and substantiate that so that when we do send that increase, it's just not cold. It's, look, what I have is we send an email to to the owner and a similar email to the tenant that basically explains that the rents haven't really moved for 12 to 13 years. During that time frame, costs for the owner have gone up, rates, insurances, mortgage, all of those things. And now that there's a justified increase by the 3 comparable properties below that have rented for you within the last 3 months within the area with the same configuration. The owner is hoping to increase the rent by this amount, let's say 10%. And we sort of open up the lines of communication. I think that if you can get the 10%, great. If you can negotiate a 5% increase and the tenant stays in the property and you don't have the cost of a vacancy period and advertising, marketing, reletting fees, it's still a win for that investor.
Okay. Matthew's asking about Aspley. We're still up in the north. What would you think of that as a suburb, and will it get some growth over the next 5 years?
Yeah, good suburb, surrounded by well-established suburbs that have all performed very, very well. I think Aspley will do, I'm confident, and I know Aspley will do very well. It's close to Chermside, very good infrastructure. Chermside's become a bit of a sort of micro hub or a business hub and within Brisbane. So I think Aspley is a great suburb, and it has historically done very well and will continue to do so.
Yeah, okay. Well, Mark, we've just gone over the hour. I think we've answered most of the questions that people have typed into the chat box and the Q&A. So it might be a good time to wrap things up for today. I imagine a lot of people watching and listening today might want to follow up, might want to have a further chat to you, or perhaps give you a call to see whether you can provide some management advice for a property that they own. How should people proceed if they want to follow up today and make contact with you?
Yeah, look, thanks, Terry. And I'm always available for quality advice or a second opinion. I can be contacted via phone or email. My email is mshorrock@Bluestone, Bluestone, P for property, M for management.com.au. My phone number is 0439 979 095. And yeah, people can give me a call, have a chat, no strings attached, commitment free. Send an email. That email might prompt a phone call. Sometimes it's easier to explain these complex situations, in person and then close them off with an email. But yeah, we can do that. Plus, I'll provide some a special limited time offer for the listeners today. I'll email that through to Terry and Katie to forward out to everybody, where we're offering 25% off our management fee for today's listeners, for anyone who changes over to us before the end of financial year.
Okay, so just pointing out to people that Katie is working away in the background there. Has just put Mark's contact details, both the email address and the phone number, in the chat box. So it's just there on the chat box. If you want, you can probably see that, the mshorrock@bluestonepm.com.au email address, and also the mobile phone number. And just repeating that special offer that's Mark's just making to people who are watching and listening today, that if you switch your property management over to them before the end of the financial year, I think you said, Mark, it was 25% off the normal management fee.
Correct.
Yep.
So I'll provide details of that to Katie. No one reaches out and makes contact with us. My understanding is we send out or Terry sends out a bit of a follow-up to this. So I'll put all of that information, plus the slides that I've been referencing in the background, with some really useful links to the articles we've talked about today. The Reserve Bank, Bill Evans from Westpac, a highly regarded economist, and the Olympic Games articles. Some of the domain and realestate.com articles that I share with our investors, I'll make available to the listeners today.
All right. Okay, well, let's wrap it up, Mark. Thanks to all the people who participated there. We've had lots of comments coming into the Q&A panel, the chat box, thanking us for the information. And you're saying always lots of great information. Thank you very much. Lots of comments like that, as well as the questions that come through. It's always gratifying to see that. Thanks for your presentation today, Mark, and your information, the benefit of your 22 years of experience, what you do in the Brisbane market at a time when I think it's a great time for people to be thinking about investing in Brisbane, because it's really now coming into that time where Brisbane is going to be one of the growth markets in the country, and those population data that's come through in the last week or so really reinforces that, plus the prospect of the 2032 Olympics. So it's all in Brisbane's favour. Great time to be, as the promo for this webinar, I said, great time to be a Brisbane landlord. So thanks, Mark, for your contribution today.
My pleasure, always a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Terry. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Okay, and again, encourage you to follow up contacting Mark with either by email or by phone number, and those details are in the chat box. And we will be sending a recording of this event to everyone who registers for it, so that information will be available there as well. Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks, Mark.
Yes.
Mark Shorrock from Bluestone Property Management. Bye for now.
Thank you.